There now follows the second of the television election broadcasts by the Conservative and Unionist Party. It is opened by the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Sir Anthony Eden, KG-MC.
Good evening. Tonight, 10 editors of leading newspapers from all over the country have kindly accepted my invitation to come and put questions to my colleagues and to me. We haven't, of course, the least idea what the questions are going to be. I only hope we shall know the answer. I have 4 colleagues here with me. On my right, Mr. Butler, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Next to him, Mr. MacLeod, Minister of Health. On my left, the Foreign Secretary. Next to him, Sir Walter Monckton, Minister of Labour. Now, we are not going to introduce to you individually the editors, but their names will be flashed on the screen as they ask their questions. The BBC have also asked the editors to be good enough to stand up when they put their questions to make things easier for the viewer, and they've been good enough to agree to do so. Now, that's all the preliminaries there are. Could we have the first question, please?
Mr. Prime Minister, 80 years ago, the Northern Echo was saying the most shocking things about Disraeli, and it remains stoutly, though independently, liberal. Its readers would like to know what a returned Tory administration might do about the Liberal proposal that there should be a Royal Commission to inquire into the present position and functions of trade unions.
Mr. Gray, that's a considerable question covering wide areas of future policy. I think we're all conscious that there are problems to be dealt with there, but I'm not sure that the Royal Commission is the right body to do it. But perhaps Sir Walter Monckton, Minister of Labour, would have a word on that.
Yes, I should like to say this, that I hope and think that during the last 3.5 years we've managed to get pretty good relationship with the trade union movement as a whole and the trade union leaders. And I'm quite sure that there are a great many problems in front of us now which we could help to solve if we sit down again together. Don't think a Royal Commission will necessarily help. I think they want to help me and I want to help them.
Next question, please.
Mr. Prime Minister, the Daily Mirror, which I represent, is not among your principal flatterers, but we have and always have had a high regard for your integrity. I would therefore be obliged if you personally would answer this question. During my time, there have been 2 sorts of Toryism. There is the Toryism of the small majority. That is the Toryism of the welfare state, a more humanitarian form of Toryism than we've known before. In pre-war years, there was the Toryism of the big majority, the Toryism of neglected housing, neglected national defence, slums, and massive unemployment. You were a minister at that time, though not for the whole period, and therefore were responsible for, at any rate, a number of years of that regime. I would like to ask you, if you go back with a very big majority on May the 26th, what sort of Toryism can we expect from your government?
I hope and believe an intelligent, progressive Toryism which tries to build, Mr. Cudlip, upon the basis of what we've been doing in the last 3.5 years. And there's one amendment I would like to make to what you said about the pre-war period. I think our housing record in the pre-war period was a remarkable one. And it's made possible what we hope to go for now, the clearance of the slum. But I think it's fair to say we'd like to be judged on what we mean to do by the extent to which we've fulfilled what we undertook to do when this government was returned under Sir Winston 3.5 years ago. Next.
Mr. Prime Minister, Scotland is never ungrateful for past mercies, but although much has been done, I regret to report we're still lagging rather badly in the fields of health, housing and employment. In particular, the unemployment rate, I think, is 2.9%. more than double the rate in England. And it may be connected with that immigration from Scotland in the course of a year is as much as from the whole of England and Wales. Well, I wondered if you might tell us what proposals the Conservative Party has to remedy that state of affairs.
Well, Leon, this is your native country. I think you should have a go there.
Well, Mr. Helburn, of course these problems exist in Scotland as they do everywhere else. I think one of the main things we've done already is to have a senior minister, as Minister of State, constantly in Scotland. I think it was Walter Elliot who said that you can't govern Scotland from a sleeping car. And it was that thought that we had when we appointed a Minister of State. As far as the other matters that you raise are concerned, when you talk about housing, well, I think you know that the housing figures in Scotland have been records in recent years. 39,000 it was, I think, in 1953. And as far as the health is concerned, the one big feature has been the most dramatic decrease in tuberculosis, which has matched what has happened in England and Wales, and the Secretary of State for Scotland and myself are in the closest touch with that. And I think that programme and that success is going on. And in exactly the same way, we are going to build now new hospitals in Scotland, just as we've started to do in England and Wales as well.
Thank you, Rex.
Mr. Prime Minister, the Socialists are saying that they will reduce the cost of living by price controls. Your own party is saying that they will do the same thing by free enterprise and competition. Well, as the editor of a paper that's a liberal and independent paper, I feel that the majority of the electorate take both views with a considerable pinch of salt. After all, the price of living is still going up. But from your point of view, from Conservative point of view, I would like to ask, I would like to say that it seems to me that from the point of view of competition, that you are not taking an energetic enough point of view on price rings and monopolies. Take, for example, television tubes, a very topical point. They were produced by the 1,000 7 years ago, produced by the million today. They're still sold at the same price, pound an inch, by 7 different companies. I know you've referred this to the Monopoly Commission, but it seems to be a very slow and cumbrous process. Why don't you take the obvious course, I think it's a liberal course, of lowering the tariffs on imported television tubes, for example, to take one example, and to get competition going that way much quicker?
Thank you. Well, Chancellor Exchequer, I think some of this at least is up your street.
Well, it's a pretty involved question, but a very good one. The position about the cost of living is that we've halved the rate of increase under our government. And when we think of the TV show last night of the Socialists, I think we've got to remember, first of all, that some of their figures and prices were pretty odd, and secondly, that we've done very much better in our term of office. It's not for them to speak about this matter compared with our record. When you talk about rings and monopolies, you may think the Monopolies Commission is a bit slow, but I think that's the best way. I've studied the system in America, and I think our system is a good deal less cumbrous than that. And I hope we shall get a report from the Monopolies Commission on these valves which you're referring to, that we may be able to take action on it, which is why we do it.
I'd like to add that the Socialists, so far as I know, didn't take any action whatever on the Monopolies Commission on the one important case that came before them.
It's also true, Prime Minister, if one can add to it, that Harold Wilson is now saying that they're going to put teeth into the Monopolies Commission, and that's a very suitable metaphor, because the only one that they took the slightest action on at all was that of dental goods.
Well, now. Yes, no.
Mr. Prime Minister, mine is Lancashire's problem. I think cotton experts on both sides now are agreed that Lancashire needs more help in her fight against cheap cloth imports. The Socialist plan seems to envisage a trade commission which they say could both control and restrict these imports. On the face of it, that has a superficial appeal to Lancashire. What is the government's view on it?
Well, I think that the offer that India made after discussions the other day to take more exports was a helpful offer. I quite realize it doesn't solve the problem, but it did something to meet it. Now, if the problem presented to us is to be what you're going to do to stop imports coming in from different parts of the Commonwealth to this country, that raises a very big issue indeed of quite another character, which would affect not only Lancashire, but all our export trade altogether. Therefore, I would say myself that that's not a decision that I would prepare to take in an election campaign, and I think it would be wrong to do. Next one.
Sir, I have a question to raise which is not really an issue at the election, and that is the question of strikes. But I raise it because the question of strikes is very urgently in the public mind at present. That has been proved by a number of pieces of evidence, in particular a poll that my own newspaper ran a short time ago. Now, I would like to ask the Prime Minister whether he thinks his government, or any other government for that matter, in cooperation with the trade unions, could devise a formula that would protect the public against the havoc and the tragedy of unofficial strikes and of communist-inspired strikes.
Walter, that's very much yours.
Well, I'd very much like to answer that question. I think that unofficial strikes are worrying everybody. I assure you they worry the Minister of Labour. But they should worry the public, and do worry the public, because they interfere with our chances of prosperity. They make employment much less certain. And in addition to that, they undermine the authority of the trade unions, because when the trade unions come to negotiate, it's much more difficult for them to negotiate if they're negotiating with men who think that perhaps they are members of the trade unions won't follow the decision which the trade unions may make. So that I'm in this trouble as Minister of Labour, and the public are in it, and the trade unions are in it, and realise it. You will have all of you seen a number of cases in which the trade union leaders have said how worried they are about unofficial strikes. I think the thing to do is to appreciate its urgency, and when the new government is returned, to get down to it with the trade unions, consult with them and with the employers. I can do it on the National Joint Advisory Council and separately, and out of that something may come. But I can only assure you of this, that I'm confident the new government will give its earnest and urgent attention to the outcome of discussions of that kind.
Next question.
Mr. Prime Minister, there are those who say that there are no real issues, clean-cut issues in this election. I'm not among them. I think this to be a most vital election, and for this, among other reasons. The world is geared to an armaments economy. The release of tension between East and West would also release a flood of productive and labour power that would cause considerable economic embarrassment to this country and to other countries. Each country will then be fighting for markets, imposing restrictions and quotas and what have you. Now, it seems to me that our lifeline may very well lie in our trade relations with the Commonwealth and the colonial empire. Is the Conservative Party fully conscious of this? Assuming they accept my proposition, have they a policy of inter-Commonwealth and inter-colonial empire trade that will take up the slack in such an event?
Yes, I think emphatically. And I'm bound to say I am not scared of the problem the facing world economy when the armaments competition, we'll call it that, comes to an end. I'm perfectly certain other schemes of development on the widest scale which can be carried through, as they are being now under the Colombo Plan, the United Nations and so on. Our part, of course, must be especially the Commonwealth part and the colonies. And one of the encouraging things of the last few years is we are beginning, our people, to save money again. And that helps us to provide the funds for colonial development, which is quite indispensable. Brings back orders here again. Thank you. Next.
Mr. Prime Minister, I should like to ask a question which I'm often asked and I don't know the answer. It's said very much nowadays that transport and its costs enter directly or indirectly into everybody's budget. And from that, it's asked if the Conservatives really do want to bring down the cost of living, why have they not reduced taxation on fuel oil and petrol? And if they are returned, do they propose to give this matter any attention?
Rev, I'm afraid this is yours too.
Well, one thing I will not do is to make promises on taxation before a general election. I'm not going to do that on any subject. But I will say this, that I'm fully aware of the importance of the high cost of petrol and the diesel oil for agriculture as well as for transport generally. And of course it has a very high priority in my thoughts. Beyond that I can't go. But remember, it's very expensive. To take sixpence off would cost about £60 million, and so it's a big thing to do. And you better see, at least we'd all better see that we get returned, and we're more likely to have a surplus from which we can do such things. That's all I can say.
Dirk?
Mr. Prime Minister, 7 or 8 months ago, Mr. Butler made what I consider a very staggering statement or forecast. He said that within 25 years, the standard of living of the people of this country could be doubled. Since then, he's had to take some emergency measures to meet a deteriorating trade position. But I see that you yourself have now endorsed Mr. Butler's forecast that that target can be achieved. Does this mean that we have turned the corner and that Mr. Gaitskell's gloomy fears are groundless?
I think it's your original suggestion. You went everything else.
Well, I think it's very right to take very seriously this question of the gap in our trade between imports and exports. And I think we should all be very wrong not to strive to improve our exports so as to bridge the gap. But the effect of our measures has been that we have now got a surplus in the April reserves, and we have reduced the trade gap from about 90 million in March to about 65 million in April. So that shows that our measures are having their effect. And I am convinced if we go on with our double policy of discipline on the one hand and encouragement on the other, that we shall do this. Remember that we can increase our standard of living if we raise production by about 3% a year. As we're now raising it at 6% a year, then I think we could double our standard of living in the time I've said. But we must all work pretty hard to do so.
Last one, I think.
Mr. Prime Minister, my question has some slight bearing on the last question.
Yes.
Sir Hartley Shawcross has declared we are on the knife edge of uncertainty between boom and bust, and unless we do something positive about it, we shall bust. And the suggestion has, of course, been made that the election has been brought about at this stage because of fears of uncertainty of the economic position later in the year. What is your answer, sir?
Well, the last part concerns me very much, and frankly, it's great nonsense. I like Sir Hartley Shawcross very much, but it never entered my head to choose to ask for the country's endorsement in this connection. There were plenty of other connections, and for me, one of the most serious was that we're going to have a very active summer in the international field. Foreign Secretary and I are going to have that to do, and it did seem to me that the government doing that ought to have the real endorsement, whoever they were, of the people of this country before doing it. Now, we've each had one, so it becomes free for all. Who would like to start? Mr. Cudlip.
May I start, sir?
You do.
I would like to ask the Chancellor a question this time, if I may. The budget which Mr. Butler introduced has become known as the rich man's budget. He, right or wrongly so, he knocked sixpence off the income tax, and this is of great benefit to big business and on the whole benefits the upper income bracket. I would like to ask the Chancellor, will it become a permanent feature of his fiscal policy to show solicitude to the rich and indifference to the less better off?
Well, the first thing, Mr. Cudlip, is that you're quite wrong. The budget's object was to relieve all, and it had the effect of relieving no less than 17.5 million taxpayers. If they're all rich, we must be a very happy country, because that brings in about 35 million families. If you take taxation off, of course the people who pay most are most relieved. And I understand what you say about the companies. But remember, the effect of taking tax off companies is that it puts a keener edge on their competitive power with the foreigner. And then you keep up full employment. Under us, for 3.5 years, we've had full employment, largely because we've given encouragement. to enterprise and to institution. And I think we were fair this time, with the 17.5 million people helping the companies and also taking 2.5 million people off tax. Give us a little more time and we'll do a little more. The answer to the end part of your statement is that we certainly want to help everybody.
Yes.
I was grateful to the Chancellor for saying that I asked a good question, but he will forgive me if I say that he didn't answer it. The point that I wanted to make was that if the Monopoly Commission is a rather slow and cumbrous way of going about these price rings, would he be prepared, would the government be prepared, to follow their own philosophy of competition and to allow international competition by reducing tariffs and allowing foreign goods to compete with these price rings in this country?
Well, insofar as we can, I should have thought this government had gone pretty far along the road of free trade. Some of our friends say we've gone quite far enough. We've just had very good dividends in hearing what the Americans are doing in freeing their trade, and we've just freed trade in Europe. And I can certainly give an undertaking that in order to sell our exports abroad and keep up our chance of standard of living here, we shall widen trade as much as we can. So I think we should go down your road as far as we can.
Yes.
Sir, 2 points in regard to the proposed four-power conversations. The Russian policy, even with its new look, seems to envisage a neutral belt in Europe, including a unified Germany, and also the virtual abolition of NATO as a defense instrument. Well, my first point is, what prospects does that leave of any progress to agreement at the four-power conversations at summit level? And the second point is, prompted by a speech by a very distinguished conservative last night, is are we sure that we know who is the summit level in the Soviet Union just now?
That's up to you. I object you, we haven't had a chance yet.
Well, I think the first thing is to get the four-power talks going. And we've succeeded in doing that. Of course, it was always part of our policy to seek these talks. But it was essential that they should be based only when we had got the ratification of the London and Paris agreements and the position of strength in Europe from which to start the talks. Now, the timetable is pretty good on that. The instruments of ratification were deposited on May the 5th. On May the 7th, the Western European Union came formally into being in the British Embassy in Paris. On May the 9th, Germany was admitted to NATO. On May the 10th, the three powers sent an invitation to the Russian government for the four-power talks among heads of governments to be prepared by meetings with foreign secretaries. And although we haven't had the formal reply, when I was dining with Mr. Molotov last Saturday, he told us that the Russian government would be very happy to accept. So I don't think that was dragging our feet. Now then, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about a lot of things, including the position of Germany. And that's going to be, of course, one of the basic problems. A lot of people think that Germany should be made neutral. And I think I can't do better than use the words that the Prime Minister used. If Germany is to be neutral and armed, why then, who is to keep her neutral? And if she is to be kept neutral and disarmed, well then who is to keep her disarmed? The problem of Germany can't be treated like that of Austria. It's a great country, 50 or 60 million people, and we have got to find a solution which is likely to lead to the reduction of Russian fears, if they have them, and yet maintain the solid strength of the Western powers. Once we give that away, why then we shall lose all the immense ground that we've gained.
Thank you. Next. Yes?
Sir, can I emphasize that in my view, and in our view, I think a lot of us think that the cost of living is one of the important issues of this election. And the socialists are plugging this at every speech they make. Does the Tory party envisage some counter-propaganda to the insidious propaganda put out by Dr. Edith Summerskill last night about the cost of food? Dr. Summerskill didn't necessarily raise the subject, but subsidies must be involved, and I would like to see the Tories nail this lie to the mast.
I'd just like to say something about that. It's quite true the cost of living rose during the war, has been rising ever since. We maintain at a considerably lower rate in the last 3.5 years than it was doing before. But if this picture is to be seen, you must bring the earnings element into it. And what we maintain, and I think is unchallengeable on the figures, whereas under the socialists the cost of living rose more sharply than the earnings, under us the earnings have risen faster than the cost of living. And that is the essence of the problem, is to be fairly visualized. Does anybody like to add anything to that?
I wonder if one can add, seeing you mentioned last night's broadcast, not about the figures, they're in dispute, to say the least about it. But I was mildly surprised to hear Dr. Summerskill speaking, as she said, as a doctor and not as a politician, talking about the food in the standard of living. Of course it's true that we're eating less potatoes now because we're eating more meat. And of course it's true that we're eating less fish because we're eating more bacon and eggs. And I think if Dr. Summerskill had happened to look at the figures of health in this country, which have never been better, particularly of the children in this country, she couldn't have possibly spoken as she did as a doctor. Of course, she might well still have spoken as a politician.
Mr. Prosser, yes?
Mr. Prime Minister, most people are agreed that my little country, gallant little Wales, is entitled to a considerable measure of devolution. May we not make an excellent start now by giving the Welsh Council a small administrative staff that might lead up to the establishment of a Secretaryship of State for Wales? Such a small administrative staff would at any rate, so long as it was composed of Welshmen, be that understood, would at any rate have the realist point of view and give some hope to Wales of a Secretaryship of State.
Well, we've done quite a bit, you know. We've moved the Education Department entirely to Wales. It's in Cardiff now, isn't it? It used to be in London. And we've got a Minister, Home Secretary, responsible for Welsh affairs entirely. Is there anything more you want to add to that, Ian, on the technical side?
No, it's true, of course, that now there is a watchdog for Wales, and all the ministers, like myself, who have responsibilities which cover Wales, look after their affairs through the Welsh Board of Health and so on. But it is of great advantage to Wales that there is somebody in the Cabinet constantly looking after Welsh interests.
Cardiff?
Mr. Prime Minister, as almost the sole representative of the opposition press, I feel I have to work harder than some of our friends. I would like to ask you this question, and ask it quite sincerely. Your reputation throughout the world as an expert in foreign affairs is well established, and if I may say so, rightly well established. But the criticism most frequently made about you in this country, which you see on your rare visit here, is that you are not well versed in home affairs, that industrial disputes, wage problems, and some of the problems which now are besieging Sir Walter Monckton, for instance, are not quite your cup of tea. What do you feel about these criticisms? Do you think they are justified or not?
Perfectly fair criticism, Mr. Cudliffe, perfectly fair. On the other hand, I have sat in cabinets now on and off for 20 years, and cabinets do deal with domestic as well as foreign affairs. And I'm afraid I've said more than somewhat, as my friend Walter would tell you, sometimes about domestic affairs.
Well, if I may add a word to that,
Yes, very quickly.
I only want to say that nobody has ever given me so much need to pay attention to my troubles as the new Prime Minister, and I've enjoyed it.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you, Mr. Cudliffe. Now, we must say how grateful we are to the editors for their kindness in coming here in this way, and we must also say good night to you all.